The silent admittance. The asphalt ribbon unspooled beneath Daniel Moore's tires, a black vein coursing through the flat, indifferent heart of rural Illinois. Dusk clung to the horizon like a bruised lament, bleeding into the pale sky in shades of bruised violet and sickly ochre. He'd driven for hours, the suburban sprawl of Chicago receding into a hazy memory, replaced by the relentless monotony of harvested fields and skeletal tree lines. A silence, profound and anticipatory, had begun to settle inside his aged SUV, mirroring the desolate landscape outside. He was a collector of echoes, a cartographer of abandonment. Daniel chased the whispers of forgotten places, the ghost notes of human endeavor left to rot. His equipment, a small fortune in high-fidelity recorders, parabolic microphones, and directional condensers, lay meticulously arranged in the passenger seat and cargo bay, tools for capturing the unseen, the unheard, the essence of decay. Ravenscroft Psychiatric Hospital wasn't just another abandoned asylum. It was a legend, a whispered curse on the lips of those few who still remembered its existence. It was the Everest of his morbid passion. Ahead, through a gap in the gnarled, forgotten woods that bordered the highway, its silhouette clawed at the fading sky. Ravenscroft. It wasn't merely a building, it was an accusation. A sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of darkened brick and shattered windows, it rose from the tangled undergrowth like a petrified leviathan, its bulk sucking the last vestiges of warmth from the twilight air. Decay had gnawed at its edges, but the core remained defiantly intact, a monument to something unspeakable. Local lore called it the Silent Night, an unexplained incident, a sudden absolute cessation of all activity one frigid December evening decades ago, had led to its immediate permanent closure. No official explanation, no public inquiry, just silence. And then abandonment. For Daniel, this void of information was an invitation, a canvas of pure, unadulterated sound waiting to be filled by the lingering resonance of its own dark history. He wasn't afraid of ghosts, he was fascinated by their frequencies. He turned off the highway onto a barely visible dirt track, the SUV's suspension groaning in protest. The overgrown path, flanked by thorny thickets and skeletal branches, clawed at the vehicle's paint. It was a pilgrimage, a descent into a forgotten pocket of the world.
The air grew colder here, acquiring a metallic tang, as if the very atmosphere itself had rusted. He killed the engine a quarter-mile from the main structure, plunging the surroundings into an unnerving quiet, broken only by the settling creaks of the cooling metal. Stepping out, the ground beneath his boots felt spongy with decades of undisturbed leaf litter. The wind, when it stirred, didn't rustle leaves, it seemed to sigh, a low, drawn-out exhalation that carried the scent of damp earth, decaying concrete, and something else, something faintly antiseptic and profoundly stale, like forgotten illness. He slung his main recording pack over one shoulder, a custom-built rig with multiple preamps and a rugged field recorder. His headlamp, a powerful LED beacon, remained off for now, allowing his eyes to adjust to the encroaching gloom. The faint, bruised light of the sky still offered a spectral illumination, casting the hospital in stark, skeletal relief. Ravenscroft loomed, a vast, complex organism of wings and towers, each window a vacant, shattered eye socket. Vines, thick as anaconda coils, strangled its walls, pulling at mortar and brick, slowly reclaiming the edifice for the earth. A rusted iron fence, bent and broken in places, marked the perimeter, more a suggestion of boundaries than a real barrier. He found a particularly gnawed section where years of neglect and perhaps a few desperate trespassers had widened a gap. He slipped through, feeling the ragged metal scrape against his reinforced trousers, a dull, grating sound that seemed amplified in the preternatural quiet. He was inside the grounds. The air here was thicker, denser, charged with an inexplicable weight. His breath plumed visibly in the chill. He walked slowly, methodically, his gaze sweeping over the crumbling pathways, the desiccated fountain in the forgotten courtyard, the shadow-draped entrance. The main doors, colossal oak affairs, were bound with heavy, rusted chains, a futile gesture against the passage of time and the inevitable decay. He hadn't expected a front door entrance. Urban exploration was about finding the weak points, the forgotten access routes. He circled the immense structure, his boots crunching softly on scattered debris. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket pressed against his ears, muffling even the distant hum of the highway. It was the kind of silence that felt like a presence, a watchful entity holding its breath.
He passed a shattered loading dock, its reinforced door buckled inward, a gaping maw into the building's lower intestines, not ideal for a controlled audio environment.
Further along, near what he surmised was the rear service entrance, he found it. A ground-floor window, its glass entirely absent, merely an empty frame staring out like a hollow eye. The wooden sash was rotten, the sill crumbled, but the opening was wide enough. He pulled on a pair of thick leather gloves, then tested the ledge, finding it surprisingly sturdy despite the evident decay. A low jump, a quick scramble, and he was through. The air that rushed to greet him was a physical entity, cold, stale, and thick with the miasma of forgotten human misery. It smelled of dust, mildew, and something subtly chemical, an old lingering disinfectant that had failed to cleanse the deeper stains. His headlamp remained off. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the profound darkness, allowing his other senses to map the immediate surroundings. He was in what appeared to be a service corridor, narrow and claustrophobic. The walls, once painted a pale institutional green, were now a peeling mosaic of cracked plaster and dark, creeping mold. He pulled out his field recorder, a sleek, black brick of advanced technology, and attached a stereo microphone. The display flickered to life, showing pristine, flat lines. He pressed record, the tiny red LED a solitary beacon in the gloom. "Ravenscroft, entry point, 2017, he whispered, his voice sounding unnaturally loud, swallowed almost immediately by the immense silence. Ambient temperature, low. Air quality, poor. Minimal external noise bleed. Initial assessment, profound decay, complete stillness. He moved forward, his headlamp now casting a crisp white beam before him, carving a tunnel of light through the oppressive darkness. The corridors stretched out, seemingly endless, lined with closed doors, each a portal to some untold story. His boots scuffed on grit and dust, a sound that echoed disproportionately, bouncing off the high ceilings and bare walls. Every step felt like an intrusion, a desecration of a sacred, terrible stillness. He found himself in what must have been the main reception area, or perhaps a waiting room. Broken chairs lay overturned, their stuffing spilling out like entrails. A reception desk, once varnished and imposing, was now a splintered wreck.
Papers, brittle and yellowed with age, lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, their faded type a testament to a forgotten bureaucracy. He knelt, picking up a fragment. It was a patient intake form, but the details were smudged, illegible. "No sound," he murmured into the mic, his voice hushed. "Just the creak of the building settling, dust motes dancing in the beam of my light. The silence here, it's not empty, it's full of pressure." He continued his methodical exploration, moving deeper into the institutional labyrinth. Corridors branched off, leading to identical anonymous wings. Each door he passed seemed to hold its breath. He imagined the lives that had unfolded within these walls, the desperation, the quiet madness, the treatments. He was a dispassionate observer, an archivist of sound, yet the sheer weight of past suffering began to press in on him, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. He entered a large common room, perhaps a dining hall or recreation area. Light from a moon, now risen and casting a sickly pallor through the high, grimy windows, painted the interior in shades of silver and deep shadow. A single rusted wheelchair lay on its side, a skeletal hand reaching out from the gloom. Scrabble tiles were scattered on a table, frozen mid-game. A child's drawing, faded beyond recognition, was still tacked to a bulletin board. These small, poignant details were like thorns, pricking at his professional detachment. He raised his parabolic microphone, sweeping it slowly across the vast empty space, trying to capture any subtle frequency, any residual energy. The recorder's display remained flat. Nothing. No electrical hum, no distant creaks from the structural integrity, no phantom whispers. Only the unyielding, impenetrable silence. But as he lowered the mic, a new sensation prickled the back of his neck. It wasn't a sound he registered, but a distinct absence of it. The air around him felt suddenly colder, a frigid breath that wasn't the natural chill of the decaying building. It was localized, a specific pocket of unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the very center of the room, near where the overturned wheelchair lay. Daniel paused, his hand tightening on the recorder. His heart rate, usually steady, gave a small, unwelcome jump. He told himself it was the drafts, the settling of the old building, the psychological impact of being in such a place. Yet the cold persisted, wrapping around him like an unseen shroud. He swept his headlamp beam across the room again, slowly, deliberately. Nothing, just the shadows, the dust, the mute testament of abandonment. He clicked off his headlamp, plunging the room into near-total darkness. illuminated only by the faint silver glow from the high windows. He stood there, unmoving, listening, straining for anything. The silence stretched, thin and taut, threatening to snap, and in that suffocating quiet, Daniel Moore, the detached audio archivist, felt an undeniable sensation. Not a presence, not a ghost, but something far more chilling, a distinct cold awareness. The building, Ravenscroft itself, had noticed him. It was no longer just an empty shell, it was a watcher, and it had finally decided to acknowledge his trespass. Part 2. The cold awareness that had settled upon Daniel was not a figment of his imagination. It persisted, a pressure against his skin, a subtle yet undeniable shift in the very fabric of the air. He clicked his headlamp back on, the beam cutting through the gloom, trying to dispel the feeling with an act of will. The overturned wheelchair, the scattered Scrabble tiles, the child's drawing, they remained as they were, inanimate testament to a life long extinguished. Yet the sense of being observed, of being acknowledged, clung to him like a shroud. "Still nothing, ambient," he whispered into his recorder, his voice strained, a lie of omission. He didn't want to admit to the microphone or to himself the profound unease that had taken root. Just the usual drafts. He moved away from the common room, his steps more deliberate now, less confident. The professional detachment he usually wore like a second skin was beginning to fray at the edges. He found himself in a main hallway, a long, sterile artery of the hospital. The institutional beige paint was flaking in large swaths, revealing the coarse concrete beneath. Overhead, recessed fluorescent light fixtures, coated in decades of dust and grime, hung like dormant organs. He moved down the corridor, his headlamp beam a solitary spear of light, pushing back the encroaching darkness. He was looking for patient rooms, for anything that might offer a sonnet slew to the hospital's past. He passed the first few doors, all closed, their small frosted windows opaque with grime. Then something flickered in his peripheral vision. He stopped, his head snapping around.
Down the hallway, perhaps 30 feet behind him, one of the defunct fluorescent lights had flickered, then hummed to life, casting a sickly, anemic glow. It was a single, defiant rectangle of pallid light in the profound darkness. Daniel froze. His internal monologue, usually a calm, analytical stream, stuttered. He swept his headlamp beam back, confirming it. The light was on. It shouldn't be. There was no power to the building. He told himself it was residual capacitance, a fault in the decaying wiring, a trick of his mind. But the light hummed with a low, almost imperceptible buzz, a sound that grated against the absolute silence of the rest of the corridor. He turned and walked back towards it, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Each step felt heavy, like wading through unseen water. As he approached, the light winked out, plunging that section of the hallway back into suffocating darkness. He stood there, the beam of his headlamp slicing through the void where the light had been. Nothing, just the oppressive chill and the scent of decay. "Malfunctioning fixtures," he muttered into his recorder, his voice thin, unconvincing even to his own ears. He tried to rationalize it, to impose logic on an illogical event, but the cold awareness was back, more potent now, as if the hospital was toying with him, making its presence known in subtle, unsettling ways. He continued down the hallway, forcing himself to maintain his methodical pace. He reached another set of doors, identical to the first. He hesitated, then pushed one open. It scraped against the floor with a sound like a tortured sigh. Inside was a small, square room, a padded cell. The walls were thick with stained, discolored padding, now ripped and torn in places, revealing the dark, fibrous material beneath. The air within was even colder, stagnant and thick. He swept his headlamp around the cell, and then he saw them, scratches, not random defacements, but deliberate, deeply gouged lines in the padding, forming letters, words. He knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the raised edges of the crude carvings. They take the words. Daniel's breath hitched. He moved his light further. They break the thoughts. More, deeper, almost frantic. I am not my own. He stood slowly, the words echoing in the silence of the cell, in the silence of his own mind. These weren't mere acts of vandalism.
These were cries, desperate messages from minds pushed past the breaking point, carved into the very material meant to contain their anguish. The raw, primal fear, the sense of violation, seeped from the walls, saturating the air.
He imagined the unseen hands, the desperate repetitive scratching, day after day, year after year, until the message was complete. He backed out of the cell, closing the door softly, as if to contain the lingering despair. His pulse hammered. This was more than ambient sound. This was a direct, chilling communication from the past. He moved further, deeper into the building's heart. He needed to find Ward C, where the clocks ran backward, where the true anomaly resided. The thought became an anchor, a focus against the creeping dread. He checked a faded map tacked to a wall, its corners curled and brittle. Ward C was on the 3rd floor, in the eastern wing. He began to search for the stairs. As he navigated the labyrinthine corridors, a new sound began to filter through the oppressive quiet. A faint crackling hiss, like static electricity. It seemed to emanate from the ceiling, from the dust-choked grills of the old intercom system. He stopped beneath one, straining to hear. The hiss sharpened, then coalesced into something distinctly human. "Daniel, are you comfortable?" The voice was soft, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a scalpel. And it was his own voice, his own cadence, his own slight inflection, perfectly mimicked. He spun around, his headlamp sweeping the empty corridor, a frantic ballet of light and shadow. "Hello?" he called out, his voice hoarse, suddenly alien in his own ears. "Who's there?" The intercom crackled again. "Daniel, are you comfortable?" The question hung in the air, a chilling echo of his own thoughts. He tore his recorder from his pack, pressing the mic closer to the intercom grill. "Recording, recording," he whispered, his hands trembling slightly. "Intercom active. Speaking. In my own voice." He felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a trick of the light or an echo. This was direct, personal. "Do you feel a sense of purpose here, Daniel? A need to uncover what was lost?" The voice was calm, conversational, utterly devoid of malice, which made it all the more terrifying. It was the detached tone of a therapist speaking to a patient, dissecting his inner world.
But it was his inner world being dissected by his own voice from the grave. He backed away from the intercom, shaking his head, a primal rejection of the impossible. This wasn't a ghost. It was something far more insidious. It was a violation. The hospital wasn't just observing. It was listening. It was learning. He found the main stairwell, a grand, sweeping structure of marble and wrought iron, now choked with dust and cobwebs. He began his ascent, his footsteps echoing hollowly, the sound of his own breathing suddenly too loud. With each floor, the air grew colder, heavier. The pervasive scent of disinfectant grew stronger, battling with the pervasive odor of decay, creating a sickly chemical sweetness. On the 2nd floor, he stumbled into what appeared to be an administrative office. Desks were overturned, filing cabinets lay on their sides, spilling their contents across the floor. Amidst the chaos, he saw them, stacks of patient files, their cardboard covers yellowed, brittle, and stained with what looked disturbingly like dried watermarks. He knelt, picking one up. The cover read, "Patient Eleanor Vance, admitted 1962. He opened it, the brittle paper crackling like old bones. The first pages detailed her admission, her supposed symptoms, severe catatonia, paranoid delusions. Her story, a tragic tale of a young woman consumed by an unnamed terror. He flipped through the pages, past treatment notes, medication schedules, therapy session summaries. Then he found it, the final entry. Diagnosis unspecified. Condition stable. Disposition not discharged. Daniel's blood ran cold. He picked up another file. Patient Thomas Albright, admitted 1959. Same pattern. Pages of treatments, therapies, observations. Final entry. Diagnosis resolved. Condition compliant. Disposition not discharged. He sifted through a dozen files. Every single one ended the same way. No one had ever been discharged from Ravenscroft. They had been treated, stabilized, resolved, but never released. The implication was a slow, suffocating dread. What happened to them? Where did they go? The hospital didn't kill them. It kept them. It admitted them, and it never let them go. He stood, the files dropping from his numb fingers to scatter across the dusty floor. The pieces were slowly, terrifyingly, slotting into place. The silent night, the sudden closure, the feeling of being watched, of being heard.
This place wasn't just haunted, it was a hungry maw, an entity that consumed. He reached the 3rd floor. The hallway here felt different, almost pristine compared to the lower levels. The paint was less peeled, the dust not as thick, but the air was colder, a profound, biting cold that seemed to leach the warmth directly from his bones. And then he saw it, a sign, meticulously preserved, hanging above a double door, Ward C. He pushed open the heavy double doors. They swung inward silently, as if oiled yesterday. The corridor beyond was immaculate, almost disturbingly so. No peeling paint, no debris, no dust motes dancing in his headlamp beam. It was as if time had stopped here, or simply refused to acknowledge decay. But it was not empty. Clocks, everywhere, on the walls, on small tables, embedded in the very architecture, and every single one of them was running backwards, the minute hands crawling counterclockwise, the second hands twitching erratically in reverse. The soft, incessant tick-tick-tick was a maddening counterpoint to the absolute silence of the rest of the hospital, a relentless unravelling of time itself. Daniel raised his recorder, its red light a stark contrast to the surreal environment. "Ward C," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Clocks, they're all running backwards. No signs of decay. This wing is different." He moved down the pristine corridor, passing more padded cells, but these were clean, unmarred. The silence was absolute, save for the chorus of backward-ticking clocks. He peered into one of the cells, empty, flawlessly clean. It felt less like a place of confinement and more like a pristine waiting chamber. And then he heard it, faint at first, like a distant hum through thick walls. A murmur, not a scream, not a cry of anguish, but a calm, collective drone of voices. He pressed his ear against the cold, smooth wall of a padded cell. The sound grew clearer. It was a group therapy session. Dozens of voices, speaking in unison, or in soft, overlapping cadences, about things that should not exist. The self is a construct. Individuality, an illusion. We are permeable. The voices were serene, almost hypnotic. They spoke of dissolving boundaries, of surrendering ego, of becoming one with an unseen, overarching consciousness. It was chillingly calm, utterly devoid of the desperation he'd expected from a psychiatric ward. This wasn't madness. It was a terrifying, deliberate process. He moved away from the wall, his mind reeling. The intercom's questions, the files, the backward clocks, the pristine environment of Ward C, the serene, disembodied voices speaking of erased selves. A chilling hypothesis began to form in his mind, stitching together the disparate threads of horror. This wasn't a place for healing, it was a place for transformation. He walked to the end of the corridor where a large reinforced door stood, unlike any other in the hospital. A plaque, still gleaming red, Experimental Treatment Suite. He placed his hand on the cold metal. The voices from behind the walls of Ward C seemed to swell, a collective gentle hum of acceptance. Daniel felt a new kind of terror, not of ghosts, but of a profound existential void. The hospital wasn't trying to scare him away, it was inviting him in, it was preparing him. For what, he couldn't yet fathom, but the answer was waiting, just beyond that door, behind the serene whispers of a group therapy session that had never truly ended. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that Ward C was not for the mad, it was for those who sought to make them mad, or something far worse, and he, Daniel Moore, the detached observer, was now squarely within its purview. Part 3. The reinforced door to the Experimental Treatment Suite was cold beneath Daniel's gloved hand, its surface smooth, almost polished. The low hum of the backward-ticking clocks from Ward C's corridor seemed to intensify, a relentless, unnatural rhythm that pressed against his temples. Behind the walls, the soft collective murmur of the therapy session continued, a chilling lullaby of dissolved selves. He took a deep, shaky breath, the air thick with that unsettling chemical sweetness, and pushed. The door swung inward with an unnerving silence, revealing a room that felt utterly out of time. It wasn't cluttered with decaying equipment like the rest of Ravenscroft, nor was it pristine and empty like the padded cells of Ward C. Instead, it was meticulously organised, a stark laboratory frozen in the precise moment of its abandonment.
Stainless steel tables gleamed faintly in the beam of his headlamp, adorned with an array of instruments that looked disturbingly archaic yet terrifyingly functional. Elaborate headgear festooned with electrodes, intricate metallic devices with fine needle-like protrusions, and glass vials filled with viscous amber liquids.
A large, high-backed chair, similar to a dental chair, but with heavy restraints, dominated the center of the room. Its leather was cracked and stained, but not from neglect. It looked like the wear and tear of intense, prolonged use. Above it, an articulated arm with a complex lens and projector assembly hung from the ceiling, aimed directly at where a patient's eyes would be. Daniel's headlamp beams swept over shelves lined with thick, bound journals and ledgers. These weren't patient files, they were doctor's notes, research logs. He carefully picked up a heavy, leather-bound volume. The cover bore no title, only a stamped, embossed symbol, an Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own tail, but with an additional, unsettling detail. The serpent's head was faceless, its body dissolving into a series of concentric circles. He opened the book, the aged paper rustling softly. The script was precise, formal, dated from the late 1950s. He scanned the pages, his breath catching in his throat as he deciphered the chilling prose. Subject 7, Project Chimera, progression satisfactory. Initial ego dissolution protocols demonstrate marked increase in suggestibility. The patient no longer identifies with their personal history, instead recognizing a collective memory matrix. The barriers of individual consciousness are thinning. The self is proving to be a remarkably fragile construct when subjected to targeted sensory deprivation and cognitive repatterning. He turned another page. Further refinements to the mirror stage therapy show promising results. By presenting contradictory reflections and auditory feedback, the subject's self-perception rapidly destabilizes. The resistance to external influence decreases exponentially. We are not merely treating madness, we are unmaking the individual, preparing the vessel for reception. Daniel felt a cold, visceral horror blossom in his chest. This wasn't about curing, it was about erasing, breaking down identity until only an obedient, malleable void remained. He flipped through more pages, the terminology becoming increasingly abstract, almost metaphysical. The prevailing psychiatric models are insufficient. Madness is not merely a malfunction of the brain, it is often a perception of truths the consensus reality cannot tolerate. We posit that what is labeled psychosis is in many cases a premature or uncontrolled opening, a doorway.
Our work here is to control that aperture, to widen it, to stabilize the connection. The silent listener, our working hypothesis for the phenomenon observed beyond the veil of individual consciousness, seems to respond to collective thought patterns. When individual minds are harmonized, stripped of their unique noise, the resonance strengthens. We believe this entity or entities has always been present, observing. Ravenscroft is merely the instrument, the focal point, to facilitate a controlled interface, to invite it through. The journal slipped from Daniel's numb fingers, clattering softly onto the steel table. Madness as a doorway, erasing individuality to invite something through. The silent night wasn't an incident of closure, it was the culmination, the moment the doorway opened. A sudden, sharp, metallic thud echoed from the corridor outside, followed by a faint, grating scrape. Daniel's head snapped up. He had left the experimental treatment suite door ajar. Now it was slowly swinging shut, the heavy, reinforced steel moving with a deliberate, almost sentient slowness. He lunged, but it was too late. The door clicked into place with an audible snick, the sound of a heavy bolt sliding home. He twisted the handle, shoved against the door. It was locked. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his professional detachment. He pounded on the door. "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice sounded thin, desperate. Only the backward ticking clocks and the faint, serene hum of the group therapy session answered him. He whirled, his headlamp sweeping the lab. He was trapped. But how? There was no one else in the building. He hadn't seen a single living soul since he entered. The hospital was playing with him, responding to his discovery, his growing fear. It was diagnosing him. He looked for another exit, his eyes frantically scanning the walls. There was a smaller, unmarked door at the far end of the lab, almost hidden behind a tall metal cabinet. He rushed to it, his heart pounding. He twisted the knob. It turned. He pulled. It opened into a narrow, dark passageway, reeking of ozone and something faintly organic, like old blood. Relief, fleeting and potent, washed over him. He stepped into the passageway, his headlamp beam barely penetrating its suffocating darkness.
It twisted sharply to the left. He followed, his boots making no sound on the strangely soft, almost padded floor.
He pushed through a hanging sheet of thick industrial-grade plastic, the kind used in clean rooms, and emerged into what he recognized as the main Ward C corridor. Except it wasn't the same. The corridor was shorter, narrower. The row of pristine padded cells he had passed earlier was gone, replaced by a single monolithic wall of smooth, unblemished concrete. The clocks were still running backward, but their collective ticking was louder, more insistent, as if amplified. And the air, it vibrated with a faint, almost subliminal thrum, like a distant, massive engine. He turned back, looking for the door he had just exited. It wasn't there. The smooth concrete wall continued unbroken, seamless. He pressed his hands against it, feeling the cold, unyielding surface. No seam, no handle, no indication that a door had ever existed. The passageway, the experimental treatment suite, had simply vanished. Daniel backed away, his mind reeling. This was impossible. He knew this layout. He had mapped it in his mind. The hospital wasn't just locking doors. It was rearranging itself, reshaping reality around him according to his fears, his disorientation. The hum from behind the walls of Ward C intensified, and now the voices were clearer, almost a chorus. Fear is the first step. Resistance is futile. Surrender is peace. He stumbled backward, seeking refuge, any escape from the disorienting, suffocating pressure. He found himself near one of the padded cells, one he swore hadn't been there moments ago, its door slightly ajar. Driven by a desperate, irrational hope for clarity, he pushed it open fully. Inside, the cell was immaculate, glowing with a soft, ethereal luminescence that seemed to emanate from the padding itself. And sitting calmly on the floor, facing away from him, was a figure. A woman. She wore a pristine white nurse's uniform, her back ramrod straight. Her dark hair was neatly pinned beneath a starched cap. "Hello?" Daniel whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The figure turned slowly with a fluid, almost mechanical grace. Her face was pale, unblemished, framed by the white cap. Her eyes, however, were unsettling. They were a pale, almost translucent blue, wide and unblinking. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips. "Welcome, Daniel," she said, her voice soft, melodious, yet utterly devoid of warmth. Daniel felt a jolt of pure terror. He had never seen her before.
But the way she spoke his name, the expectant gaze, it was as if she knew him, had always known him. He backed out of the cell, his headlamp being wavering. Who are you?" The nurse didn't answer, only continued to smile. Her eyes seemed to track him, even as he moved. He turned and fled down the corridor, the backward ticking clocks now deafening, the serene voices chanting. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from her, from this impossible, shifting prison. He ran, his breath ragged, turning down another corridor, then another. The hallways twisted and turned, each identical, each leading to a dead end or back to a place he had just left. He passed a row of windows, but the outside was a blur of featureless gray, a thick, impenetrable fog that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. He stopped, leaning against a cold, smooth wall, trying to catch his breath. The silence, save for his own ragged gasps and the distant, constant tick of reverse time, was absolute. He pulled out his recorder, pressing the mic to his lips. Disorientation, extreme, he stammered, his voice raw. Layout shifting, witnessed a figure, nurse, unidentifiable. As he spoke, he looked up. Down the long, perfectly straight corridor, at the very end, stood the nurse again. She hadn't moved. She was simply there. But something was different. Her hair was slightly shorter, framing her face differently. Her smile was broader, more knowing. Her eyes, still pale blue, seemed to hold an even deeper, more ancient understanding. She was closer this time, impossibly so. His blood ran cold. He turned and ran again, a primal scream caught in his throat. He burst through a set of double doors, finding himself in what looked like a large, circular observation room, ringed with dark one-way mirrors. In the center, a single plush armchair sat beneath a low, humming light. He was trapped. The doors he had just entered through vanished, replaced by the seamless wall. The mirrors reflected his terrified face, multiplied infinitely.
And then, from behind one of the mirrors, a voice, his own voice, came through clearly, intimately. Diagnosis: severe anxiety, acute disassociation. Prognosis: highly receptive to repatterning. The voice was calm, analytical, clinical. It was dissecting him. The hospital wasn't just diagnosing him, it was processing him. He looked at the armchair in the center of the room.
It seemed to beckon, to offer a perverse comfort. He felt a profound weariness, a desire to simply sit down, to let go. Then, across the circular room, he saw her again, the nurse. She was standing in front of one of the mirrors, her reflection perfectly clear, but this time her face was subtly altered. The bridge of her nose was slightly different, her chin a fraction less pronounced. The eyes, though still pale blue, held an unnerving glint of recognition, as if she had seen him before, many times, in many different forms. She raised a hand, beckoning him forward, her smile widening to reveal teeth that seemed a little too sharp, a little too numerous. Daniel screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound, torn from the depths of his being. He hammered on the mirrored walls, trying to break through, to escape this nightmare that was twisting his reality. The hum in the room grew louder, the light brighter, pressing down on him. The reflections of his terrified face distorted, stretching, blurring. He was losing his grip, his sense of self eroding under the relentless assault of Ravenscroft. He felt a profound, chilling certainty. He was not merely an intruder, he was the next admission, and the nurse, with her shifting face and knowing eyes, was waiting to greet him. Part 4. The scream tore from Daniel's throat, ragged and desperate, a futile protest against the encroaching madness. The circular observation room pulsed with a low, oppressive hum, the light from the ceiling fixture growing brighter, harsher, bleaching the color from his surroundings. His reflection in the surrounding one-way mirrors stretched and warped, a dozen terrified Daniels contorting in a silent, grotesque pantomime. The nurse, standing impossibly calm across the room, her latest permutation of a face, smiling that unsettling, knowing smile, began to slowly, deliberately raise her other hand. It was an invitation, a silent command. He stumbled backward, away from her, away from the beckoning armchair, away from the mirrors that seemed to absorb his very essence. His headlamp, once a defiant spear of light, now seemed dim and impotent against the oppressive glow of the room's overhead fixture. He pressed his palms against the cool, unyielding surface of the mirror, searching for a seam, a weakness, anything that would break the illusion. Nothing. The hospital had sealed him in.
The voice from behind the mirrors, his own voice, returned, closer this time, resonating from all directions at once, enveloping him. Acute paranoia, delusional ideation, a strong attachment to individual autonomy. These are resistances. The words were not an accusation, but a clinical assessment, a diagnosis being meticulously constructed around him. We must address these resistances, Daniel, for your own comfort, for your peace. The nurse took a single measured step forward, her movements impossibly graceful. Her pale blue eyes, now seeming to glow with an internal light, were fixed on him. Her smile deepened, revealing the slightly too sharp teeth, a detail that made his stomach clench with an ancient primal fear. He clutched his recording equipment, a last desperate anchor to his professional purpose, to reality. He pressed the mic to his lips, but no words came out. His breath was ragged, his throat constricted. He couldn't speak, couldn't document, couldn't rationalize. He was simply prey. He felt a deep, profound weariness seep into his bones, a desire to simply cease fighting, to surrender to the overwhelming pressure. The hum of the room intensified, vibrating through his very teeth. The light grew brighter still, an unbearable white glare that threatened to scour away his vision. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the light seemed to penetrate his eyelids, painting the inside of his mind with a searing white emptiness. When he opened his eyes again, the room had shifted. The mirrored walls were gone. He was in a small, square room, a padded cell. The soft, luminescent padding, like that he had seen in the pristine cells of Ward C, surrounded him. The air was still and cold, but the oppressive hum was gone, replaced by the faint, distant tick, tick, tick of the backward clocks. He was alone. The nurse was gone. The voices were gone.
Only the profound, disorienting silence remained, broken by the impossible clocks. He scrambled to his feet, pressing against the padded walls. They were seamless, impenetrable. He was in a cell. His cell. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He pounded on the padding, his fists making no sound, absorbed by the thick material. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed, muffled, lost in the suffocating quiet of the cell. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to examine himself. He looked down at his hands. They were his hands, still gloved, still clutching the recorder. But they felt distant.
Not quite his own. A chilling sense of detachment began to creep over him, an insidious numbness. He sank to the floor, leaning back against the padded wall, his eyes darting around the pristine cell. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He was a rational man, an urban explorer, a documentarian. This was a trick, a hallucination, a sophisticated psychological operation designed to break him. He knew that, but the knowing felt thin, fragile, easily shattered. He raised his recorder, his last link to his objective, to his self. "Recording," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Subject: Daniel Moore. Location: unknown padded cell. Symptoms: profound disassociation, temporal confusion, perceived architectural shifts. Attempting to maintain objectivity. The words felt hollow, like sounds without meaning. As he spoke, he became aware of a new sensation, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the padded wall behind him. He pressed his ear against it, straining to hear. It was the group therapy session again, but closer now, clearer. The voices were no longer speaking in unison, but in a quiet, measured dialogue. "And what did you lose when the self began to fray?" a soft female voice asked. "The burden of choice," a male voice replied, calm and even. "And what did you gain?" "Peace," another voice, younger, answered. "The clarity of purpose, the awareness of the great design." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. These were not the desperate cries of the insane. These were calm, reasoned answers, spoken by people who had truly found something in their transformation, something terrifyingly coherent. They had surrendered, and they had found peace. He pulled away from the wall, his mind grappling with the implications. The experimental treatments weren't meant to make people mad. They were meant to make them compliant, to erase their individuality, their will, until they became open vessels, conduits for whatever silent listener the doctors had been trying to contact. And the voices, the group therapy, was the living testament to their success. A soft click echoed from somewhere above him, followed by a faint whirring sound. He looked up. A small circular vent in the ceiling, previously unnoticed, began to emit a fine, almost invisible mist. It was odorless, but he felt an immediate, subtle pressure behind his eyes, a dull ache that spread rapidly through his skull. His thoughts began to slow, to blur at the edges. He tried to stand, to move, to escape the mist, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. A profound lethargy washed over him, a seductive desire to simply close his eyes, to let the pressure subside. He fought it, tried to focus, but the edges of his vision began to shimmer, to distort. The padded walls seemed to soften, to pulse with the same ethereal luminescence he had seen earlier. The group therapy voices, now much louder, seemed to emanate directly from within the padding itself, surrounding him. They were no longer distinct, but a collective hum, a chorus of serenity. "Let go, Daniel. Release the tension. Become permeable." He felt his grip on the recorder loosen. His fingers, once so adept, now felt clumsy, alien. The mist thickened, swirling around him, painting the cell in a hazy, dreamlike glow. The pressure in his head intensified, not painful, but insistent, persuasive. It felt like a gentle hand pressing against the very core of his being, slowly, carefully, molding his thoughts. He saw her again, the nurse. She was standing in the corner of his cell, a phantom presence woven from the mist in the glowing padding. Her face was different again, subtly. Her eyes were still pale blue, but now they held a depth, a wisdom, that was both ancient and utterly new. Her smile was less a threat, more an invitation, serene and understanding. And in her hands she held a small polished silver bell.
She lifted it gently, and a single soft ring filled the cell. It was a pure, clear tone, resonating through his skull, harmonizing with the pressure, the mist, the voices. It was a sound of profound peace, of complete surrender. Daniel felt a profound shift within him. The fear, the panic, the desperation, they began to recede, like a tide pulling back from the shore. The relentless urge to fight, to resist, to understand, began to dissolve. He felt lighter, emptier, yet also filled with an immense calming quiet. His individuality, his unique self, the very core of his being, felt like a fragile shell cracking open, allowing something vast and indifferent to seep in. The nurse took another step, her form shimmering in the mist. She was now impossibly close. Her face in this latest iteration was almost beautiful, utterly calm. She reached out a hand, not to touch him, but to simply gesture towards his head. And in that moment, Daniel understood. The hospital didn't kill intruders.
It didn't drive them mad in the conventional sense. It admitted them. It dissolved them. It took their self and remade it, erasing the noise, leaving only the calm, obedient vessel. He was not being driven mad. He was being unmade. He looked at the nurse, her serene smile, the silver bell in her hand. He no longer felt fear, only a profound, aching weariness. He felt a strange sense of anticipation, a quiet acceptance. His thoughts, once a tumultuous torrent, were now a placid, slow-moving stream, easily guided. The mist continued to pour from the vent, saturating the air, saturating him. The pressure in his head became a comforting presence, a gentle hand guiding him towards an ultimate silent peace. His recorder slipped from his hand, clattering softly onto the padded floor, its red light still glowing, a tiny defiant ember in the encroaching white. The nurse stepped back, her form dissolving into the mist. The bell chimed again, a soft resonant ding that seemed to echo not in the room, but within the newly hollowed chambers of his own mind. He felt a profound sense of belonging, of being home. The self, with its messy desires and fears, was almost gone. The doorway was open, and Daniel, the urban explorer, was no longer exploring. He was being admitted. The night, so full of terror, was slowly, terrifyingly becoming silent. Part 5. The bell chimed again, a single pure note that resonated not in the air of the padded cell, but deep within the labyrinthine passages of Daniel Moore's consciousness. It was a sound of absolute, unburdened peace, a sonic caress that smoothed the last jagged edges of his resistance. The mist, pouring in an unseen torrent from the ceiling vent, swirled around him, coalescing into patterns of ethereal light that danced at the periphery of his vision. It was no longer cold. It was a warm, enveloping blanket, a final, gentle dissolution. His grip on the recorder had long since vanished. It lay on the luminous padding, its tiny red light a forgotten ember, flickering weakly, a last dying pulse of individuality in the encroaching white. The pressure behind his eyes, once a discomfort, was now a soothing weight, a subtle hand guiding his thoughts into placid, obedient channels. The frantic internal monologue, the desperate analyses, the primal fear, all had receded, replaced by a vast, serene emptiness. The nurse, her face shifting with each beat of the bell, was no longer a distinct entity.
She was woven into the mist, into the luminescence of the padding, into the very fabric of his dissolving self. Her smile was the light, her eyes the pervasive blue hue, her voice the collective hum of the therapy session, now a gentle internal chorus. "The noise is gone," the voices whispered, no longer from outside, but from within his own burgeoning emptiness. The static cleansed. The self merely a filter, and now it is removed. Daniel felt his mind expand, not into an abyss, but into a calm, boundless ocean. The memories of his past, his name, his home, his passion for urban exploration, the very concept of Daniel Moore, became distant, shimmering fragments, like light refracted through deep water. They were not lost, but they no longer held meaning, no longer resonated with the core of his being. They were simply data, disconnected and irrelevant. He felt a profound sense of relief, a liberation from the tiresome burden of thought, of choice, of individual existence. The insistent, backward-ticking clocks of Ward C, once a maddening counterpoint to his sanity, now became a comforting rhythm, a gentle undoing of time,
a return to a primordial, unformed state. He was not falling, he was being carefully, meticulously laid to rest. The final chime of the bell was long, lingering, a sustained hum that vibrated through every cell of his body, harmonizing his existence with the pervasive presence of Ravenscroft. It was a sound of completion, of successful repatterning. The mist thinned, then vanished. The luminescence of the padding softened, then faded. The cell returned to its pristine, ordinary emptiness, but Daniel was no longer ordinary. He sat cross-legged on the padded floor, his back perfectly straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap. His face was devoid of tension, his eyes wide and clear, fixed on a point in the distance that only he could perceive. A faint, serene smile played on his lips, an expression of utter tranquility, of perfect, unassailable peace. He was no longer Daniel Moore, urban explorer, documentarian, collector of echoes. He was an echo, perfectly tuned, ready to resonate with the vast, silent listener. He was admitted. A low, distant thrum of an engine, a sound alien to the decades of silence, began to vibrate through the foundations of Ravenscroft. It was the mechanical groan of a utility truck struggling up the overgrown dirt track.
The sky outside, previously a canvas of bruised twilight, now bled with the pale, anemic light of a new dawn, pushing back against the lingering shadows. The front doors of Ravenscroft, colossal oak affairs that had been chained and barred for over half a century, swung inward with a faint metallic groan. Not rusted and decayed, but freshly oiled, moving with an almost anticipatory ease. Through them stepped a small group of individuals, their uniforms a crisp clinical white, gleaming faintly in the nascent light. They carried clipboards, their faces serene, almost vacant, their eyes holding a distant, knowing calm. They looked like medical professionals, yet their movements were too synchronized, their expressions too uniform, their presence too quiet. They were the morning staff. They moved with practiced efficiency through the previously impossible labyrinth of Ravenscroft. The corridors were no longer choked with debris. The peeling paint had been smoothed over, the shattered windows replaced with opaque frosted glass. The profound decay that had permeated the lower levels was gone, replaced by a clinical, sterile order. The faint lingering smell of antiseptic and stale illness was now sharp, clean, freshly applied. They ascended the grand stairwell, their soft rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the freshly polished marble. The backward-ticking clocks of Ward C had given way to a steady, rhythmic tick-tock, forward-moving, yet somehow equally unnerving in its relentless precision. The air in Ward C was no longer cold. It was regulated, temperate, a perfect environment for something. They reached the doors to Ward C, pushing them open. The corridor beyond was immaculate, glowing with a soft, uniform light from recessed fixtures. The padded cells, once empty, now held occupants. Each door bore a small brass plaque. On one of them, the nameplate, freshly polished, read, Moore, D. The staff member, a tall woman with dark hair pulled back severely, approached Daniel's cell. She glanced at her clipboard, then peered through the small reinforced window. Daniel sat exactly as he had been, cross-legged, serene, smiling faintly. She opened the cell door with a soft clack. The air inside was still and clean. Daniel didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply continued to smile, his eyes fixed. "Good morning, Daniel," she said, her voice soft, devoid of inflection. "Did you sleep well?"
Daniel turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. He did not blink. His smile remained fixed, serene. "I am well," he replied, his voice calm, even, utterly devoid of his previous inflections. It was his voice, yet not his. It was a voice that had been polished, refined, stripped of its unique resonance, leaving only a perfect, unmarred clarity. The patterns are clear. The frequencies are aligned. The purpose is understood. The staff member nodded, making a note on her clipboard. Her expression remained neutral, unreadable. "Excellent," she murmured. "And the questions, Daniel? Have you processed the questions?" "The questions are self-correcting," Daniel replied, his voice a quiet hum in the cell. "The cell is permeable. The observer is constant. The admittance is complete." Another staff member, a man with equally serene eyes, approached the cell. He handed the woman a fresh patient chart. She opened it, her gaze falling on the first line. Patient, Moore, Daniel. Admission date, current date. Previous diagnosis, acute self-awareness, resistance to collective consciousness, delusional autonomy. Her finger traced down the page to the final chilling verdict. Diagnosis: self-awareness successfully removed. Condition: stable, compliant, receptive. Disposition: admitted. She closed the chart, a faint, almost imperceptible satisfaction playing on her lips. She looked at Daniel, still sitting perfectly, still smiling. From a pocket in her pristine white uniform, she produced a small polished silver bell. She lifted it gently, and its clear, pure tone resonated through the quiet of Ward C, a soft ding that seemed to hang in the air, echoing through the immaculate corridors, through the closed doors of other cells, through the very foundations of Ravenscroft. The staff member rang the bell again. Ding. And again. Ding. And again. Ding. Over and over, the soft, therapeutic bell rang, a gentle, incessant sound of perfect control, of eternal admittance, echoing through the now active halls of Ravenscroft Psychiatric Hospital, a monument to the silent, unending night.